Hello and welcome to a session about what's new in the next generation of Visual Studio. And just to set your expectations, next generation of web tools, I kind of mean both what's coming for RTM of Visual Studio 2012, but also what are we going to ship after RTM. Because we did not actually have time to get everything in 2012. I'm Mads Christensen. I'm a program manager here on the ASP.NET team, specifically for the editors in Visual Studio, the web editors, CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. So before we get going, I just want to give a shout out to Twitter. If you have any questions as we go along, just tweet them, and the crew out here backstage, they will show me the tweet so I can answer any questions. Also, if you go to jabber.com, there's a chat room called ASPConf. You can do the same there. So let's get started with Visual Studio 2012 RTM. So I'm sure that a lot of you, I'm just being told it's called jabber.net, JABBR.net. That's where you can find the chat room. Anyway. So, Visual Studio 2012 RC has been out for quite a while, and a lot of things have been going on behind the stage between RC and RTM, and we're going to look at some of them here today. I want to give you like a big, broad introduction, but a kind of advanced introduction to some of the cooler things that you'll find in the web editors in Visual Studio. So let's start with HTML. And HTML is the most complex editor in Visual Studio at all. It does a lot of things. It does HTML, does CSS, JavaScript, C#, Visual Basic, Razor, and so on. So that also means that when I say HTML, I mean web forms, I mean MVC, Razor, whatever HTML flavor that you're using in your project, basically. So this is a web form, but could have been CSS HTML, could have been just a plain old HTML file. Now let's write some code. So one of the things that I've been really annoyed with is the fact that we've never inserted the quotes automatically when I write my HTML attribute. But as you saw here, now we do. So we've changed the default behavior. You can turn it off, but I just want to call it out because I was just really annoyed with it before. So I think that was kind of nice. So I'm writing my div, but what I really wanted to do is I wanted to write a p tag instead. So you'll see here, as I type one end of the HTML element, the other element updates accordingly. And of course, this goes both ways. Right? And IntelliSense works just as you would expect. So really nice, really easy way to kind of just change your markup, maybe upgrade your markup to HTML5. Because isn't that what you do these days anyway? And besides, the HTML editor is full HTML5 compliant, understands everything HTML5. We even have some new really cool snippets. So I can do video. And I get this nice snippet. We understand that there are different sources for different types of video files and formats. And we do all that automatically. And of course, you have audio in the same way right here. So this audio file, this audio element, maybe I want to extract it into a user control in web forms. Right now it's just here in my ASPX and I want to extract it. So what I would do before is that I would actually go my Solution Explorer and say, add new item, and I will choose a user control. I had to search for it, and so on. right? So what I can do now in 2012 is that I can just select whatever markup that I want to have extracted. Then I kind of right-click, and I can say, well, extract to user control. So what that does is that it pops up this file chooser here, and I can choose my file name. Let's just call it audio. And we put it in the root. That's fine. And exactly what you would expect is what happened here. We have our audio user control. We now have it registered on the page, and we reference it exactly where the markup used to be. So very, very easy, very, very clean workflow. So this was just very, very difficult before. You had to go through a lot of steps. Now, one of the things that we've been working hard on for 2012 is looking at the workflows, just like this one. There's been so many workflows that has just been suboptimal prior to 2012. So what we really want to do is to really take a look at them and improve them. And one of the workflows that we see over and over again people complain about or maybe have some issues with is the switch between design view and source view. So the problem is that some things you can actually only do when you are in design mode, but you might only want to be in the source mode. You don't like the designer. You might find it too slow to open up. For whatever reason, that workflow could be improved. So let's look at some of the things we've done here. Let's build a data grid or grid view. And if I want to do some work on some of the columns or some formatting, what I would have got to do was to go into the design view to actually invoke some of the smart tasks, to pop up the wizards, to add data sources, to do all these things. And they were only available from the designer. But now, you can see here, I have this little smart tag. So this is actually the same smart tag as we've had in the designer. It's the same smart tag as you'll find in C#. And this is also the exact same menu that you see in the designer. So now we can do the auto formation, we can format elements, we can edit columns, add data sources, and so on. And we can do that directly within source view. So we no longer have to make the switch to do some of these, maybe sometimes complex tasks. They're now available to us just where we want them. Another workflow, again with the designer, has been to hook up events. Now this is something we know for many years actually has been sort of a problem for a lot of people. So let's say I have a button, and let's give it an ID, button save, whoops. So what we see a lot of people do is actually that they go to the design view and then they double click the button, because what that does is that it creates the event handler in the C# code behind, or Visual Basic code behind. But again, we have this weird kind of workflow going back from design view to source view. So what we've done now is that we've taken all server-side events for all server-side controls, not just ASP.NET controls, but any custom controls as well. And what I can do now, let's just look at the on-click event right here. Here's what we get from IntelliSense. It now lets us create a new event handler. And let me just click that. And you can see it gives me the name, and it seems to not do anything else but that. So that means now I can actually continue typing out my markup, and then I can return to my code behind when I'm ready for it. Because what actually happened is that in the background, we opened, or Visual Studio opened the code behind file and created the event handler. And it put in the right event arguments, and this works, as I said, for all server-side events. Let me just bring up IntelliSense. As you can see here, if I already had my event handler, it would just pop up here and it would be really, really easy. So, to me, one of my favorite features in the HTML editor for sure. Okay. Let's look at some CSS. CSS is kind of a strange thing. Let's do one here. So, CSS for many people is something that's just really boring. Right? I totally understand that. It's something we're aware of, that it's a problematic thing because most people don't like CSS and they would actually prefer not to write CSS. I believe it's a chicken and the egg kind of thing. There has never been a tool that makes it good and easy to build CSS, and that's why people don't like it, right? And that's just, it's a vicious circle right there. But what I think now is that we finally have a tool that is not only great, but probably the best in the industry. So this is really, really a game changer. So what I'm going to show you here is some of the cool stuff that we have for RTM. Right? So this is going to ship in the box. This is going to be RTM. Most of it you'll find in the release candidate as well. And then afterwards we can look at some of the things to come for the next, for after RTM. So first off, you'll notice that CSS can do outlining. We can do other really nice stuff. Look how I now have a color picker, like for the first time. This is also, again, workflow. What did you do before? How did you work with colors before 2012? Well, what most people did was that they would have Photoshop open or Paint.net or something like that, so that when they could get a color that they liked from a website, they would do a screenshot, copy it into Photoshop, and then grab the color from there and then back into Visual Studio. Kind of problematic. Now this is, I think this is much cooler. So let's just create a, let's do a color right here. Let's do a background. So what you'll notice here is that the IntelliSense is actually kind of clever. So we've updated the entire CSS editor. Actually, we threw everything out. There is nothing left of the CSS editor that we knew from Visual Studio 2010. It's all brand new. And that allowed us to do some cool stuff with IntelliSense, like what I'm going to show you here. So as you type, the list is gonna, the IntelliSense list is gonna reduce to match what you type. Now that might not be that impressive, you might think. But the real cool thing is the way that you're gonna use it. So background image, I would write like this. Because we do this auto reduce and we do it kind of cleverly where we look at the hyphens and the first characters of each word, we can do some really, really cool things. So, for instance, I never write border radius, right? I just write radius, like this. Text decoration, TED, right? So, for me, this has completely changed the way that I write CSS. So it's much quicker, it's much faster, it's easier to work with. Now, let's play with that background thing. I'm going to invoke the color picker again, and now you can see that there is this vertical bar right here. Because this color right here is something that's already defined just above. So we actually show you all the colors that you already have in your document. This is really, really neat because we see over and over again that people end up having 13 different shades of gray, like the same gray. So this is really, really nice. I have a question here from Kevin Opie. I think I pronounced your name correct. When will we get .less support in Visual Studio? I will get back to that because I have a cool announcement to show you later. So, you see here how I can use the keyboard to just navigate the color picker. If it doesn't show up here, if I hit the arrow down, I get down to this list and I can navigate back and forth. If I hit the down arrow again, it opens a full-fledged color picker, just as we know from other like Photoshop, Paint.net, and so on. It even allows me to do CSS3 coloring to handle the opacity, which is a new concept in CSS3. And here's the cool thing, right? The big workflow issue where you want to steal a color from a website and move it into your own style sheet. You now have an eyedropper right here. So you can click this eyedropper and you can click anywhere on your screens or multiple screens, any app that you have open, including a browser, and you can steal the color. It's as easy as that. So one of the real big issues that we know that people just don't like about CSS is the fact that there is no guarantees that your style sheet is actually going to work in different browsers. That's a huge problem. It's not like we have a compile time error, we don't get runtime errors. It just either works or doesn't work. We don't really know until we try it. So debugging story is kind of bad for CSS. But what's really, really bad is also that there is no help. There's no help regarding all these vendor-specific properties that we're going to use all the time. Right? If you have border radius, you also need to have like the Mozilla implementation and the WebKit implementation. But you might not know that. And there are so many properties that require these that it would almost be impossible. Well, the good news is that we have updated the CSS editor to actually understand snippets. So if I do border radius and I hit the tab key again, you can see here we actually do it for you. All right, so you no longer have to remember exactly what it was that, what type of vendor specifics that you needed. And this is not only for like the big ones. It's not only for border radius. We have 78 of these actually. So this covers everything. Here's one of the really bad ones, because you see here it actually requires all 4 vendor specifics. And you see here, of course, IntelliSense still works when we're dealing with snippets. So it's a really, really nice way of writing something that at least gets us a lot closer to certainty whether or not stuff is going to work in all browsers. Control KC, I can now comment out CSS. That's very nice. Control KU, it never worked. This is the first time we see it. This is in 2012. Why we didn't do it 5 years ago, I have no idea. But now we do. Here's another thing that we have added. Regions. Right? So we know this from other editors within Visual Studio. And now we have this here in CSS as well. So we've tried really hard to make sure that all your muscle memory, all the things that you're used to do in C# and JavaScript and all the other editors now also work in CSS. Same shortcut keys, everything the same. Your muscle memory is now restored in CSS. Okay. That's enough of CSS right now. Let's look at some JavaScript. So JavaScript is really, really awesome. And if you saw Howard's talk just before this one, and you want to use bundling and minification, then it's probably because you have a lot of JavaScript. And that's exactly what we're seeing these days, that we have more and more JavaScript. And that also makes it more and more important that our editor is really modern and understands whatever it is that we need it to understand. So what we've done in 2012 is to remove the old editor completely. None of it has survived. We have, from bottom up, built a brand new JavaScript editor in Visual Studio. So what that means, from a technical point of view, is that it runs on top of Internet Explorer 10 JavaScript engine, the one called Chakra, that you might have heard of. It's one of the fastest JavaScript engines out there, if not the fastest. And it's very, very precise. And by precise, let me show you what I mean. Here is a function called move. So you might recognize what these three comments are. These were introduced some years ago in 2008 or 2010 to add comments to your functions, just like we know in C# when you write comments to classes and properties and methods and so on. But what's really cool about this is that now we can, for the first time, actually infer what the types are that we get in a function as parameters, right? X and Y, there has never been a way for us to express what those two types could be or should be. What I do right here now is that I tell explicitly that I expect X and Y to be a number, right? Parameter name X should be of type number, and Y should be of a type number 2, right? So this establishes that X and Y are now numbers. But if I want to call this function called move, you can see that the IntelliSense I get actually now tells me what this function expects to get in parameters. So that's a huge step forward when you think about how little we knew about the functions we were calling before. We may have had naming conventions. Not everyone kept those. So this is a really nice feature. Now let's look at the IntelliSense. This is where Chakra really kicks in. So I had my parameter called X. And you see here, this is clearly IntelliSense meant for a number, right? Exponential to a fixed number, precision number, so on. And of course, that's because we tell Chakra that it is a number. So nothing special about that. Now let's create a string. And for that, I'm going to say X plus Y. And if I invoke IntelliSense on X plus Y, what should I get? Well, I should obviously get a number, right? X plus Y is still a number. A number plus a number is a number. So how did we know that? How did we know that that this expression is a number? The only way Visual Studio will know that is because it actually runs all your JavaScript. So this is where we have the huge difference. All your JavaScript code is constantly being run, very efficiently I might add, by the Chakra engine. So it always knows what all your variables are, what all your expressions are, what types there are, and so on. And that is what helps drive IntelliSense. So that's why that the list we get right here is that of a number. But if I call toString, and I now do invoke IntelliSense, we can see that we now get the string IntelliSense. Now this makes perfectly sense because I just called toString. However, Visual Studio has no idea what toString is. It's just a member on the number prototype, and it does not know what it is. But because it runs it, it knows what it returns. And that's how it knows it, like this. So let's go a little bit deeper into how cool this really is. So here's an array. Right? It contains a number as the first argument, and then a string, and then a date. Right, so this is clearly kind of a maybe not your most typical array, but nevertheless. So let's take a look at the newly created A, which is our array. Now, so I equals 0. That means that we should expect IntelliSense for a number. And that's exactly what we get in here. Now, if I was 1, we should get this string, right? And lo and behold, that's exactly what we have. And just to finish it here, if it's a date, we get IntelliSense as if it was a date time. So yes, it actually runs your entire code. It runs inside your loops. It knows everything, more or less, as much as it can, right? So that's pretty cool. jQuery. jQuery is used by most people, and we've had kind of good support for it over the years, and that support has now gotten a lot better. So let's take a look at jQuery. Now look at this. I open the jQuery constructor, and the IntelliSense I get is one that looks like one we know from C#, right? It has overloads. Here we have a method call or a function call with overloads. For those of you who know JavaScript, you'll know that the language JavaScript does not have the concept of function overloads. So this is kind of weird. Now, it's also cool because it kind of looks like C#. It looks like, dare I say it, almost not type safety, right? What we saw before, where we could say that the parameters of the move function were of a specific type. Right? We can give the illusion, because that's what it is. Remember, this is a dynamic language. The editor can give the illusion that this is a type safety environment to some extent. So let's find all the buttons on my page. And you see here, I still get very, very rich IntelliSense. I even get all the descriptions of all this stuff. As you can see here, how many overloads there are, and so on. And let's say we want to set the HTML. Again, I get like full IntelliSense. This is so close to what we know from C# that it's just that good. It's simply just that good. And it's not just jQuery. jQuery, if you get the latest jQuery on NuGet, then you will have this in Visual Studio 2012 beta. Just go update your NuGet package in your existing solution if you're using Visual Studio 2012, and you will get this experience. Another fun little thing about JavaScript is that we have full support for HTML5. That means all the new APIs, right? You can do WebSockets, file readers. Here's a file reader. So we can new up a file reader and get all the right IntelliSense just as we would expect. So file reader is a brand new HTML5 API that's really powerful for doing certain things. But we have like WebSockets and workers, web workers, and all this good stuff, all fully IntelliSense. Really, really sweet. All right. So that concludes, unless there are any questions, and bring them on. That will conclude the RTM, or the release candidate version of Visual Studio. Now let's look ahead. So here's what's coming. Now, a funny thing, these days we're talking a lot about thick clients, right? So a thick client being a lot of JavaScript, a lot of CSS, and then maybe just a web API as a backend, like an ASP.NET web API. So all your logic kind of lives in JavaScript. And there's a lot of things we can do to help that experience when you have a very, very heavy client, like a lot of JavaScript, and you're talking to a server-side model. Maybe you have C# model classes exposed through Web API or MVC, but they're completely disconnected, right, from your JavaScript and from your server. You kind of have to recreate the same object model both places. So one thing that is kind of common is that when you want to play around with or use a third-party JSON API, let's say you want to talk to Twitter's API because you want to add a little widget of your last tweets or your latest tweets on your blog. So you would go to Twitter's developer site and look at some of the examples of what the JSON looks like that they're going to return to you. And from that, you can kind of start building your object model. It's not very efficient. So here is actually, I've cheated. Here is actually a JSON string. This is actually taken from the Twitter API. And it would be really cool if I could just right-click, say paste special, and say paste JSON as classes. So let's try to do that. It went, yeah, it was pretty fast. But here's the result. So this makes it a lot easier to actually parse the JSON string that I just have in the clipboard, that I just copied from Twitter's website, and turn it into actual C# classes or models if we want to use them in a Web API or MVC context, right? So let me just build this. Now, if we go back to JavaScript, then look at this. Let's take a look at this guy. So one of the models that we just included from our JSON is called parent. So let's say that I have a call where in JavaScript that calls down to that endpoint on my Web API. The Web API will now return the parent object as a JSON object. How do I then get the IntelliSense I need? Well, here's one version of what we've been kind of playing around with. These are early prototypes. We're kind of just trying to see what's possible. So this is one of my earlier ones. But the idea is kind of good. I like the idea that I now have full IntelliSense on my server-side objects. Right? These are actually the ones from the Twitter JSON API. Like coordinates created at, and so on. Right? Coordinates created at actually did come from here. So we do have a beginning of a mapping between client and server. So this is one way it could look like. Another thing it could look like is this. What if my Web API actually would generate a JavaScript proxy data layer for me? That would help things a lot. Like imagine when you did work with SOAP or web references, you would say, add new web reference or service reference, and you would pass it in a SOAP address, and it would generate all those proxy classes for you. So you just talk to those C# proxy classes, and then behind the scenes, the actual communication between the endpoint and the client would be handled by those classes. Now, we've been playing around the same ideas for JavaScript, just to see if they make sense. And they could be something like this. Right? See how this is automatically generated? I have users because I have a Web API class called users, and it has all my Web API methods: put, post, get, and delete. Right? So if I do a get or get all, I will actually receive an array. As we can see here, the callback sends me an array. And if I want to delete, it just wants the number. It wants the ID of the user. So this is kind of similar to the idea of having those proxies generated automatically. For Web API, for MVC, for web forms, anything for that matter on top of ASP.NET. Now here's a third option. What if what if you have clients that are not web clients? You have clients that are, iPhone clients, Android, Windows Phone clients, and so on. Well, they probably don't use the same JavaScript and whatnot for doing this call down to your data layer. They use other things. So that also means that your endpoint might not be on the same server as your actual website is running, right? Because if it's on a phone, if it's an app on your Windows Phone, well, that kind of lives on your Windows Phone, doesn't live on your server. So the idea of you want to generate an AJAX call to some endpoint somewhere in the world, and you want to have that all done in a nice way and very easily, requires something a little bit different. So here's an idea that we've been playing with, and of course, all these ideas, please give me feedback on Twitter and whatnot if you think these are crazy or weird or cool. But here I have one. So I right-click in my JavaScript file, and I say create AJAX call. And let's say that actually I want to call Twitter API. I want to use a get, and my server-side model is, let's just keep with the parent that we just created from Twitter, right? And then finally I have this type thing. So the idea is that I can use jQuery, I can use whatever underlying technology I want, JavaScript library, or just pure JavaScript to do the actual AJAX call. But let's just stick with jQuery. And you see this is what we get. So it's not very much right now. Other non-jQuery libraries or pure JavaScript, they will have a lot more JavaScript. But the idea is the same here, that you automatically get this knowledge of what is the server-side model that's going to be returned. And again, you get the full IntelliSense for it. So you get some really, really cool things in a relatively easy way. And of course, this is all run by T4 templates. So if you can NuGet some T4 templates into your project, and you can now then start using that way, another way, MooTools, Dojo, Scriptaculous, all these different ways there is to do AJAX call. You can now do that through NuGet. So these are just prototypes. There's no dates on any of this. We're just playing around with it. So all of this JavaScript, all these thick clients, a lot of the time you want to use some sort of templating, right? You want to use templating for data binding your JSON objects from your JavaScript to your HTML markup. And there are some really good frameworks out there. Knockout, Backbone, Mustache, Handlebars, and the list goes on. One of the things that we've been looking at is that new notion of the Mustache handlebars. For those of you who don't know what it is, let me just show you. It's basically the curly braces, 2 curly braces on each side. That's a mustache, right? Curly is a mustache. So hence the name, Mustache and Handlebars. And here's what a syntax or for data binding from JavaScript into HTML could look like. So if name, right, if there is a name in the return JSON, then type out the first name and the last name. And again, down here, for each user in my JSON object, write out the name of the user. So this is a very, very typical, straightforward example. But there are very many flavors of these. So I mentioned Mustache and Handlebars, and there are other ones. Some of them, they look similar, but not quite the same. But they could look like they start with $, and then they might have, if name. Right? We try to handle all of these different flavors of, I just call them mustache as a general term. That might be a better one, I think. I think it's a good description, like the curly brace syntax for this. There are other ones. There are some that uses different syntax for localizing. Some uses like a third curly for doing HTML encoding, and so on. So you see here we have kind of catered to all of these different kind of flavors. Also, when we're talking about Knockout and Backbone, we don't actually have anything that would provide IntelliSense or anything like that, but it is coming. Right? It's something that we're working on, but I don't have anything to show you right now. Okay. Now, where did my CSS go? Okay, I want to return to CSS. So, as I mentioned before, it is really something that people don't like. And I know that a lot of people, they don't even want to hear about it because they just don't like it at all. I urge you to stay around if that's the case for you, because what I'm going to show you is going to be pretty cool. So I showed you the CSS editor that we're shipping for RTM. So this is the exact same editor, but with an extension on top of it that utilizes some of the extensibility that we have that is brand new for 2012 that allows us to do a lot of cool things. So some of you might have remembered or even use an extension called Web Essentials for Visual Studio 2010. So what I have here is Web Essentials for Visual Studio 2012. And it can do a lot more than we were able to before. So let me take you through some of these things. There is way too much that I will be able to go through all of it. But we can take the most important ones. So right off the bat, when you see my CSS file right here, you see that we have color squares. And if I click them, I get the color picker. Right? This makes it very, very easy for me to see where my colors are and so on. So that's very, very nice. There are other visual cues that helps me out here. For instance, if I hover over fonts, it will actually give me a preview of what they look like. And that's always a little bit difficult to know exactly what a font looks like. The biggest problem for me personally when I build websites is 12 pixels of Verdana equally sized as 12 pixels of Arial, right? No, it's not. You have to, but you never know until you see them side by side. So this is kind of cool. Also images. We get full preview of all images. And here's a kind of a cool thing. We also get to know which browsers support what. I'll get back to that one because that's a little bit special and a little bit extra cool. All right. So here's a color. Have you ever been in this situation where you just want to take your color that you use as a background, for instance, and say, I just want it a little bit lighter or a little bit darker? Well, now you can with a shortcut. So the idea here is that you hold down Shift and Control, and then you use the the arrows up and down. So you can go up and you can go down. The color stays the same, it just gets lightened or darkened. So this is very, very nice for colors. We can do the same for any number. Let me just write like this. Right, so it's clever. So we have a question about JavaScript test runner integration. We don't have one for RTM. there is a really good open source one on Codeplex, and it's called, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, but it's called Chukpa. It works beautifully with Visual Studio 2012. It is an awesome unit test runner, so if you want to play around with JavaScript unit testing, try it out. I think it limits you to use 1 or 2 frameworks. I think JSUnit and QUnit, but I'm not sure. But check it out, Chukpa. All right. It also brings us the notion of smart tags. So we're going to see this throughout the remainder of the time here, because this is kind of nice. So smart tag is what we know from C# and what you saw from HTML. Now we also have them here in CSS. So smart tag is basically added functionality. I can now convert any color to any other format. Right? Oops. Very easy. Okay. Now, so all of Howard's, or a lot of Howard's talk just before mine, was about minimizing the number of requests that goes between client and server, or browser and web server. And one of the ways we can do that is through the optimization framework, where we take all our CSS and bundle it into one file. Another thing we can do is that we can take the background images that we have in our style sheets and embed them directly into the style sheet. This sounds weird, but you can do that. You can actually take the byte array, the actual bytes of an image, then you can base64 encode all the bytes, and you can stick that base64 string into your style sheet. Now that's kind of not easy to do. But as you may have seen, we have this little smart tag on our image here. And I can now say embed as base64 data URI. And that's exactly what it did. So it added a long string here for my image. But it did more than that. It also added this background image with a star in front of it. And this is kind of important. So we've been looking at hundreds, and I mean literally hundreds of real-world style sheets. This is something that people use all the time. You use the star to say that this is only supported in IE7 and below. Any other browser will ignore this line completely. And the reason for that is that this data URI that we have up here, which is completely valid W3C standard data URI, is not understood until IE8. Right? So we have to maintain this line below for older browsers if we do care. Right? Not everyone has to target browsers before IE8. And of course, the preview still works even though we have it as a base64. All right. Now let's look at an existing website, right? Because that's what we all have. We all have existing websites. I'm going to take a file. I have like a bunch of real-world files. And the one I want to show you is Twitter. Not because there's anything wrong with Twitter. It's just because their file, their CSS file, is actually really good. And I want to demonstrate exactly how easy it is for really good front-end CSS developers to miss a lot of things. And then I'm going to show you how you don't have to anymore. So this is Twitter. And let me start by opening this dreadful thing. So if you're anything like me, you never used your arrow list in CSS back in 2010. I would just always turn it off because it would always tell me that CSS3 stuff was invalid. stuff that I knew was valid. I knew that border radius was valid, but Visual Studio disagreed. So I just turned it off. In 2012, you must never turn off your error list or warnings, as it is by default, because they actually make sense. It's not like before. Now they actually do make sense. And they do have some really good insights. Right. Here's a color, but you see I missed a comma, and that's why I had the problem, right? How would you find this before? Well, Twitter couldn't. There's a lot of these things that we've added a lot of error checking so that you will avoid having the problem where certain things doesn't work in certain browsers. And just to illustrate what I mean by that, we give you full IntelliSense for all the vendor specifics, right? Just to give you an idea of what that looks like. This is Mozilla for Firefox, Microsoft for IE, Opera, and WebKit for Chrome and Safari. So there's a lot. There's a lot of these. And let's just play around with Moz Appearance. So look how I get IntelliSense for the whole thing here. But we've taken it one step further. If I do a mistake, it's actually going to call it out and say, hey, this is not a valid value. Why this is extremely important is because there has been no way before to catch these things. No one validated it against all your vendor-specific properties, but we do now. And this should give you a lot more confidence in the code that you write and know that, well, it might just actually work, right, in the different browsers. So if we take a look down here, for the first time, we now have messages. We have never used messages in the CSS editor. So let me just show some of these. This is where it gets really cool, because here I have an existing style sheet, and it tells me that I have 75 issues that I should probably, perhaps if I wanted to, it's a message, right? It's not an error or a warning, but it tells me that I have a lot of browser compatibility problems, browser compat. And the typical browser compatibility problem is the lack of vendor-specific properties, the ones that make them work in all browsers and all versions of all browsers. And here's an example of this. Here's a browser compatibility problem. It says, I forgot to add the missing vendor-specific property for the WebKit browser. So what I can do now is I can, you see I get this smart tag again. I can click it and say add missing vendor specifics. And here we go. It was as easy as that. The problem is, of course, that only took me down to 74. So it would be cool if I can just do all this at one time. Now take a look at this. I can right click anywhere in my file, go on the Web Essentials menu here, and it doesn't have any icons yet. This is still pretty early. But I have these 4 commands. Remove duplicate properties. We do that, and we just take them one by one. Remove duplicate properties. It can do it automatically only, let's say that you have a rule, and inside that rule you have display block twice. It will remove the first, or it will keep the last and remove any prior of that last one, but only if the values are exactly the same. So it's safe. Don't worry. Then we're going to add some missing standard properties. So this occurs quite a lot, especially when we're dealing with touch, right? When we're writing CSS, perhaps for the iPad, we only use WebKit specifics, but those are all standards now, or some of them are. So that means that not only is there the dash WebKit property, but now there's the equivalent standard one that works in all browsers, potentially. So we have to make sure that if we have some of those properties that does not have a standard property, that we add those too. And here is this is the opposite, right? This is where we have the standard property, but we don't have all of the vendor specifics. So if I have border radius, and I only have Mozilla or Moz border radius, but I forgot WebKit border radius, this function here will add them. So here we go. You see now we're down to 12 messages from 75. So we're is going the right way. And then we can say alphabetize all properties. Now, this is a bit controversial because it's actually not what I wanted, so this is probably subject to change. The problem is real, though. The problem with making sure that you have the vendor-specific properties always before the standard property. And the way that I do that is by sorting. I have a sorting algorithm that does that through this button. So I just want to demonstrate that to you right here. So you see, that brings us down to 5 messages. Now there were a few of them here that it actually did ignore. So we're just going to do those automatically. And you see now we're just down to 3 problems. Right. So this is a problem that we see again and again and again. Again, this is a message. This is not a warning. It's not an error. It's just that when you use display inline, right here, then height and width makes no sense. They are simply ignored by browsers. So we should remove these two. So height and width should go. And then we have this guy with the float. It says float is already in this rule, right? It's defined right here. You should remove any unnecessary duplicates. It does not have to be unnecessary. It could be for good reasons, for browser difference reasons. So what we do there is that say then you should put them together side by side. Right? Then that would cause no problem, because if you do this, it is probably a browser-specific thing, and you know better probably, right? So we're not going to call it out. So now we're actually, like, within a minute, we could take a file and, clean it up completely, make it more browser safe. Okay. So let's look at something cool. Let's do border radius. So border radius, here we go. And we do 5 pixels. So you might have noticed here how some of these vendor-specific properties are kind of faded in the background a little bit. And we do that because that makes it very clear that these are kind of dependent, or they have a parent. They are sub-properties under another property. But they only remain kind of in the background as long as the values are the same as their parent. Right? As long as Mozilla border radius has the same value of 5 pixels as the other one. So if I change this to 50 pixels, it will immediately pop out, and we can now see it's no longer a parent. It's no longer a child under another property. Again, here, if I mouse over, it will tell me exactly what browsers support what. And for a lot of the properties, it will actually tell me what version of what browser supports what. This has taken quite some time to actually find all this data. So let's just go back to 5 pixels. Now the cool thing is that if I change the standard property, you see that all of the children will follow along. So I only have to make this change once, but only if the values are matching. right? So this makes good sense. It makes it much easier. If we do 8, they should be the same, and we can continue. Here we go. So it's a lot easier now than it ever was working with vendor specifics. Making sure that you can take whatever file you already have and just open it in Visual Studio, whatever CSS file you have, and we will tell you exactly what could be problem areas in terms of browser compatibility, which is the big problem in the world of CSS3 and thick clients and smartphones that get updated all the time. So a huge difference. We have a lot of other big differences in terms of like productivity and just like makes it more fun to write. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? So if we do a new selector right here, you'll see I get full IntelliSense for HTML elements. That's kind of neat. So let's go ahead and let's do a class name. You'll see I get all the class names that are used in my file up here. I'll do the same with IDs, and I can even chain them. I can do a pseudo selector. So I can say where this is not clear fix, for instance. So you can see here how easy it is for me to write my selectors without fearing that I'm going to misspell things. So that's kind of nice. So let's look at CSS3. CSS3 is, of course, this new thing that maybe isn't all that new. And the thing is that there are so many different aspects of it that it makes it kind of difficult to know exactly what browsers support what and what do you actually have to do to make certain things work. And so we see a lot of people having the workflow of, going to a search engine to search online, what do you, how do I do certain things, and then they come back with the answer. Maybe there is some copy-paste going on, but they can't remember, right? For me, I can't remember the syntax of every little CSS3 thing. So here's one of the things that I can't remember. A media query. I'll do tab, and you see that we give you a full snippet for media queries. So that's really, really making it easy. Another thing is font, right? It's kind of a complex syntax, but now it makes it really, really easy for me. I don't have to go to my search engine and come back with a result and copy paste and all that stuff. But sometimes I have a workflow that's just kind of different. If I want to work with a font, I'm probably somewhere within font family here, right? Notice the one that says pick from file. It allows me to select a font that I have in my project or anywhere on disk. And here I have two fonts. They have the exact same name, Cursive Sans, but they have different file formats, a TTF file and a WOOF file. WOOF is the new CSS3 standard, supported in IE9 and all of the browsers. TTF is supported in IE way back when. So, and there are 4 different formats. There's SVG as well, and then there's EOT. So, but these two takes you far. So, excuse me, I only have the 2. I don't have to insert both of them though. I'll just choose one of them and see what happens here. It inserted the name correctly, Cursive Sans, because that's what it then defined up here. It actually added the whole font face embedding for me. So it also knew that it had both a TTF and a WOOF, because it looked at disk and said, hey, you have two formats on the same name, Cursive Sans. So I'm going to take both of them. So that's kind of neat. And of course, if I want to embed my font as a base 64 string, I can do that too. Okay. I had a question the other day. Will we have support for important, or not support for, but IntelliSense for? And yes, as you can see here, you do have IntelliSense for that. Just keep the questions coming. So we had the question coming in before. Do we have less support, and when will it be supported? Well, as you saw, if you saw Howard's talk, that he was talking about how you could take less and CoffeeScript and serve it through the bundling and minification feature of ASP.NET 4.5. Now let's begin with the beginning here. Less and CoffeeScript are both languages that are sitting on top of CSS for the less, and CoffeeScript sits on top of JavaScript. So the way you think of it is that you have a different syntax, a different way of writing your, for instance, JavaScript. You don't write it in JavaScript, you write it in some higher language, and it then compiles into JavaScript. CSS is, less or .less is the same. And because we have this runtime piece that makes it very easy for us through the bundling and minification to actually handle that compilation step that requires you to go from CoffeeScript down to JavaScript so the browser can understand it. Because we have that pipeline in place through bundling and minification, the only thing left was actually to have the support in the editor in Visual Studio. So let's look at Hot Coffee right here. So as you can see, we have a nice editor here for CoffeeScript. So you can now finally get like a nice editor support for when you're writing this language, and that's the first time actually that we've done anything with CoffeeScript. So that's pretty cool. Let me also show you .less. So less is different than CoffeeScript because less is actually CSS. It is CSS, but it's something more than CSS. It's like a CSS++. It's a superset of CSS. And here are some examples. So in less you have a variable. In this case I have a variable with the name of corner that I've given the value 15 pixels. You can see here we already know that the variable corner is unused. So something is going on beyond just colorization, right? Another difference between CSS and less is the abilities to do, you could call them macros, you can call them functions. Basically they're called mixins, and we have an example right here called rounded corners. So what this allows me to do is to take a lot of functionality, in this case all the border radius that matches all the browsers out there, and take a parameter called radius. So this looks like a function, right? And it actually allows me to call this mixin that's called rounded corners by doing rounded corners, and that's all I need to do. So here I'm just down in a selector. I'm now calling another what just appears to be a CSS a rule, but that's not what it is. It's a mixin. So I'm basically taking all of this and putting it into my header rule down here. And because I didn't specify any parameter, it will just use the default value, which is 5 pixels. I could choose to say, oh, let's do it 13 pixels. And then that's what would be compiled into CSS and would make it all work. We could also do the whole corner thing right here. So we get full IntelliSense. It actually tells us the value of our variables. So for less, it's actually pretty cool because because it builds on top of CSS. So that means that all the features we have in CSS will automatically also apply to less. Right, so that's why you see here how the everything here looks the same. You get the nice CSS, color picker, all those things, because less is just CSS. So that's kind of nice. So what we're aiming for here is a full-fledged less editor. Now, what about the other flavor of that's similar to less? That's called SCSS. I'm not talking about Sass, but SCSS. Well, hopefully we're going to get to that too, but we're going to start with .less. So I hope that answers your question from before. Okay. So all of this talking about standards and browser compatibility, why would you even think that when we ship RTM that we would actually have, that we wouldn't already be outdated? Right. 3 months later, or maybe the same day, new browsers pop up, everything is outdated. We're no longer relevant. That is a real concern, and that has kind of always been the case, but not anymore. We actually have the ability to update all the files, all the schema files, all the CSS3, HTML5 support. We can update that automatically. So this is completely new, has never happened before in Visual Studio history, and it makes sure that whenever you open Visual Studio, you always know you have the latest and greatest. And I actually have an example of just how comprehensive our list is. So here's a website that I've built that actually takes all the support from within Visual Studio and kind of just build a data set for a website to look at. So what you see here is actually something that we ship. We ship files that knows exactly what browsers support what in CSS. And that's 310 properties. Right, that's a lot. But then comes 260 vendor-specific properties. Right, and again, we know exactly what browser, we know what version of the browser supports it. But that was only properties. Then we have pseudos and add directives and so on. So this has not been a small task at all, but I just want to make sure that you're aware that we are not going to go out of date. We're going to keep updating these files. We're going to keep updating your Visual Studio installations with the newest files, so that you're always, so that you can always trust Visual Studio in that regard. All right, so I'm almost out of time. So if you have no further questions, I don't know if we have any incoming here in the last minute. No new questions coming in. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I hope that you will enjoy Visual Studio 2012 and all the goodies that I've shown you that we're actually going to ship around RTM. So you're going to get all what I've shown you. So thanks for watching.